Chapter 5 of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Coffee Break Collection 23, Mysteries, Riddles and Conundrums. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in September 2019. Chapter 5, Advice from a Caterpillar. The caterpillar and Alice looked at each other for some time in silence. At last the caterpillar took the hookah out of its mouth and addressed her in a languid, sleepy voice. "Who are you?" said the caterpillar. This was not an encouraging opening for a conversation. Alice replied rather shyly, I hardly know, sir, just at present. At least I know who I was when I got up this morning, but I think I must have been changed several times since then." "What do you mean by that?" said the caterpillar sternly. "Explain yourself." "I can't explain myself, I'm afraid, sir, because I'm not myself, you see." "I don't see," said the caterpillar. "I'm afraid I can't put it more clearly," Alice replied very politely, "for I can't understand it myself to begin with, and being so many different sizes in a day is very confusing." "It isn't," said the caterpillar. "Well, perhaps you haven't found it so yet," said Alice, "but when you have to turn into a chrysalis, you will some day, you know, and then after that into a butterfly, I should think you'll feel it a little queer, won't you?" "Not a bit," said the caterpillar. "Well, perhaps your feelings may be different," said Alice. "All I know is it would feel very queer to me." "You?" said the caterpillar contemptuously. "Who are you?" Which brought them back again to the beginning of the conversation. Alice felt a little irritated at the caterpillar's making such very short remarks, and she drew herself up and said very gravely, "I think you ought to tell me who you are first." "Why?" said the caterpillar. Here was another puzzling question, and as Alice could not think of any good reason, and as the caterpillar seemed to be in a very unpleasant state of mind, she turned away. "Come back," the caterpillar called after her. "I've something important to say." This sounded promising, certainly. Alice turned and came back. "Keep your temper," said the caterpillar. "Is that all?" said Alice, swallowing down her anger as well as she could. "No," said the caterpillar. Alice thought she might as well wait, as she had nothing else to do, and perhaps after all it might tell her something worth hearing. For some minutes it puffed away without speaking, but at last it unfolded its arms, took the hookah out of its mouth again, and said, "So, you think you're changed, do you?" "I'm afraid I am," said Alice. "I can't remember things as I used to, and I don't keep the same size for 10 minutes together." "Can't remember what things?" said the caterpillar. "Well, I've tried to say, 'How doth the little busy bee?' but it all came different," Alice replied in a very melancholy voice. "Repeat, 'You are old, Father William,'" said the caterpillar. Alice folded her hands and began. "You are old, Father William," the young man said, "and your hair has become very white, and yet you incessantly stand on your head. Do you think at your age it is right?" "In my youth," Father William replied to his son, "I feared it might injure the brain, but now that I'm perfectly sure I have none, why, I do it again and again." "You are old," said the youth, "as I mentioned before, and have grown most uncommonly fat. Yet you turn a back somersault in at the door. Pray, what is the reason for that?" "In my youth," said the sage, as he shook his grey locks, "I kept all my limbs very supple. By the use of this ointment, 1 shilling the box. Allow me to sell you a couple." "You are old," said the youth, "and your jaws are too weak for anything tougher than suet. Yet you finished the goose with the bones and the beak. Pray, how did you manage to do it?" "In my youth," said the father, "I took to the law and argued each case with my wife, and the muscular strength which it gave to my jaw has lasted the rest of my life." "You are old," said the youth. "One would hardly suppose that your eye was as steady as ever, yet you balanced an eel on the end of your nose. What made you so awfully clever?" "I have answered 3 questions, and that is enough," said his father. "Don't give yourself airs. Do you think I can listen all day to such stuff? Be off, or I'll kick you downstairs." "That is not said right," said the caterpillar. "Not quite right, I'm afraid," said Alice timidly. "Some of the words have got altered." "It is wrong from beginning to end," said the caterpillar decidedly, and there was silence for some minutes. The caterpillar was the first to speak. "What size do you want to be?" it asked. "Oh, I'm not particular as to size," Alice hastily replied, "only one doesn't like changing so often, you know." "I don't know," said the caterpillar. Alice said nothing. She had never been so much contradicted in her life before, and she felt that she was losing her temper. "Are you content now?" said the caterpillar. "Well, I should like to be a little larger, sir, if you wouldn't mind," said Alice. 3 inches is such a wretched height to be." "It is a very good height indeed," said the caterpillar angrily, rearing itself upright as it spoke. It was exactly 3 inches high. "But I'm not used to it," pleaded poor Alice in a piteous tone, and she thought of herself, "I wish these creatures wouldn't be so easily offended." "You'll get used to it in time," said the caterpillar, and put the hookah into its mouth and began smoking again. This time Alice waited patiently until it chose to speak again. In a minute or 2 the caterpillar took the hookah out of its mouth and yawned once or twice and shook itself. Then it got down off the mushroom and crawled away in the grass, merely remarking as it went, "One side will make you grow taller, and the other side will make you grow shorter." "One side of what? The other side of what?" thought Alice to herself. "Of the mushroom," said the caterpillar, just as if she had asked it out loud, and in another moment it was out of sight. Alice remained looking thoughtfully at the mushroom for a minute, trying to make out which were the 2 sides of it, and as it was perfectly round, she found this a very difficult question. However, at last she stretched her arms around it as far as they would go, and broke off a bit of the edge with each hand. "And now, which is which?" she said to herself, and nibbled a little of the right-hand bit to try the effect. The next moment she felt a violent blow underneath her chin. It had struck her foot. She was a good deal frightened by this very sudden change, but she felt that there was no time to be lost, as she was shrinking rapidly, so she set to work at once to eat some of the other bit. Her chin was pressed so closely against her foot that there was hardly room to open her mouth, but she did it at last, and managed to swallow a morsel of the left-hand bit. "Come, my head's free at last," said Alice, in a tone of delight, which changed into alarm in another moment when she found that her shoulders were nowhere to be found. All she could see when she looked down was an immense length of neck, which seemed to rise like a stalk out of a sea of green leaves that lay far below. "What can all that green stuff be?" said Alice, "and where have my shoulders got to? And, oh, my poor hands, how is it I can't see you?" She was moving them about as she spoke, but no result seemed to follow, except a little shaking among the distant green leaves. As there seemed to be no chance of getting her hands up to her head, she tried to get her head down to them, and was delighted to find that her neck would bend about easily in any direction, like a serpent. She had just succeeded in curving it down into a graceful zigzag, and was going to dive in among the leaves, which she found to be nothing but the tops of the trees under which she had been wandering, when a sharp hiss made her draw back in a hurry. A large pigeon had flown into her face, and was beating her violently with its wings. "Serpent!" screamed the pigeon. "I am not a serpent," said Alice indignantly. "Let me alone." "Serpent, I say again," repeated the pigeon, but in a more subdued tone, and added with a kind of a sob, "I've tried every way, and nothing seems to suit them." "I haven't the least idea what you're talking about," said Alice. "I've tried the roots of trees, and I've tried banks, and I've tried hedges," the pigeon went on, without attending to her, "but those serpents, there's no pleasing them." Alice was more and more puzzled, but she thought there was no use in saying anything more until the pigeon had finished. "As if it wasn't trouble enough hatching these eggs," said the pigeon, "but I must be on the lookout for serpents night and day. Why, I haven't had a wink of sleep these 3 weeks." "I'm very sorry you've been annoyed," said Alice, who was beginning to see its meaning. "And just as I'd taken the highest tree in the wood," continued the pigeon, raising its voice to a shriek, "and just as I was thinking I should be free of them at last, they must needs come wriggling down from the sky. Ugh! Serpent!" "But I'm not a serpent, I tell you," said Alice. I'm a... "Well, what are you?" said the pigeon. "I can see you're trying to invent something." I'm a little girl," said Alice, rather doubtfully, as she remembered the number of changes she had gone through that day. "A likely story indeed," said the pigeon in a tone of deepest contempt. "I've seen a good many little girls in my time, but never one with such a neck as that. No, you're a serpent, and there's no use denying it. I suppose you'll be telling me next that you never tasted an egg." "I have tasted eggs, certainly," said Alice, who was a very truthful child. "But little girls eat eggs quite as much as serpents do, you know." "I don't believe it," said the pigeon. "But if they do, why then they're a kind of serpent, that's all I can say." This was such a new idea to Alice that she was quite silent for a minute or two, which gave the pigeon the opportunity of adding, "You're looking for eggs, I know that well enough, and what does it matter to me whether you're a little girl or a serpent?" "It matters a good deal to me," said Alice hastily, "but I'm not looking for eggs, as it happens, and if I was, I shouldn't want yours. I don't like them raw." "Well, be off then," said the pigeon in a sulky tone, as it settled down again into its nest. Alice crouched down among the trees as well as she could, for her neck kept getting entangled among the branches, and every now and then she had to stop and untwist it. After a while she remembered that she still held the pieces of mushroom in her hands, and she set to work very carefully, nibbling first at one and then at the other, and growing sometimes taller and sometimes shorter, until she had succeeded in bringing herself down to her usual height. It was so long since she had been anything near the right size that it felt quite strange at first, but she got used to it in a few minutes and began talking to herself as usual. "Come, there's half my plan done now. How puzzling all these changes are. I'm never sure what I'm going to be from one minute to another. However, I've got back to my right size. The next thing is to get into that beautiful garden. How is that to be done, I wonder?" As she said this, she came suddenly upon an open place with a little house in it about 4 feet high. "Whoever lives there," thought Alice, "it'll never do to come upon them this size. Why, I should frighten them out of their wits." So she began nibbling at the right-hand bit again, and did not venture to go near the house till she had brought herself down to 9 inches high. End of Chapter 5 of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Advice from a Caterpillar.
How do you find this book? Any thoughts about the book or the author? Any suggestion for improvement? Please take a moment to share your thoughts in a comment. If you like it, share it with your friends who might enjoy it as well. Subscribe to keep in touch. Visit CompleteAudiobooks.com for more quality content.
AD 1048, and the Case of Diabolical Sorcery in Rome, by Roger of Wendover, died 1236. Coffee Break Collection 23, Mysteries, Riddles, and Conundrums. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. AD 1048. After Gregory, Clement sat in the Roman chair 9 months and 6 days, and in the same year Damasus succeeded him, and sat 26 days, after whose decease Leo succeeded, and filled the chair 5 years, 2 months, and 6 days. In the days of this pope there was discovered at Rome a case of diabolical witchcraft unheard of in our times. There lived together in a cottage situated on a public road leading to Rome 2 old women, both given to witchcraft. When a stranger came to them unattended, they would transform him into a horse, or swine, or some other animal, and they spent in drunkenness and gluttony the money they acquired by the sale of these animals. It happened that these women entertained a certain youth, who gained his livelihood as a juggler, and was skilful in dancing. And in the night they transformed him into an ass, and made much gain by him. For by the change the youth had by no means lost his understanding with his speech, but performed as an ass whatever tricks and vagaries the old women bade him. The ass's fame spread through the country. A certain wealthy man came and bought him of the witches for a large sum of money. And as he took the ass away, they warned him to keep the ass from getting into water, if he would have daily entertainment from him. Accordingly, the rich man set a vigilant keeper over the ass, and whenever he wished for amusement, he delighted his guests with the ass's tricks. Satiated at last with this sort of entertainment, the ass was kept with less vigilance, and one day, breaking his halter, he made his escape, and plunged into a neighboring pool, where, after a few turns in the water, he recovered his human form. The ass's keeper followed him, and on sight of the man asked him whether he had seen an ass. The man replied that he was the ass, and that he had lately resumed the human form, and then related the whole of his adventures. The man in amazement related the story to his master, who communicated it to Pope Leo, before whom the women were at last convicted and made confession of their guilt. But on the Pope expressing his doubts, and affirming that it was a frivolous tale, Peter Damian proved the truth of it, and cited the case of Simon Magus, who made Faustian appear in the likeness of the said Simon, to the horror of his sons. End of AD 1048, and the Case of Diabolical Sorcery in Rome.
Cleopatra, how did she die? From famous mysteries, curious and fantastic riddles of human life that have never been solved, by John Elfreth Watkins. Coffee Break Collection 23, Mysteries, Riddles, and Conundrums. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrea Kotzer. Cleopatra, how did she die? For her actual beauty, it is said, was not in itself so remarkable that none could be compared with her, or that no one could see her without being struck by it. But the contact of her presence, if you lived with her, was irresistible. The attraction of her person, joining with the charm of her conversation and the character that attended all she said or did, was something bewitching. It was a pleasure merely to hear the sound of her voice, with which, like an instrument of many strings, she could pass from one language to another, so that there were few of the barbarian nations that she answered by an interpreter. In these words did Plutarch describe Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt, daughter of Ptolemy Auletes. This arch-temptress of all the ages was born at Alexandria, Egypt, 69 years B.C., and with her brother Ptolemy became joint ruler over Egypt when she was a sprightly girl of 18. After having enjoyed a reign of but 3 years, she was dethroned by her brother's partisans. While their respective armies were preparing for war, Caesar arrived in Egypt and reinstated her upon her throne. Then followed a liaison between the young Queen of the Nile and the middle-aged conqueror of the world. It lasted until there was born to them a son, Caesarion, and during 2 years afterward, at which time Cleopatra lived with Caesar in Rome, not returning to Egypt until after his murder in the Senate. 3 years later, the calm of the Siren of the Nile was to be again disturbed by a noble Roman, this time the handsome and dashing Mark Antony, who had been appointed ruler of Asia and the East. Being summoned before Antony to answer accusations of having aided his enemies, Cleopatra came sailing to him in a barge with gilded stern and outspread sails of purple, while oars of silver beat time to the music of flutes and fifes and harps. She herself lay all alone under a canopy of cloth of gold, dressed as Venus in a picture, and beautiful young boys, like painted cupids, stood on each side to fan her. Her maids were dressed like sea nymphs and graces, some steering at the rudder, some working at the ropes. As a result of this excursion, Antony became her captive instead of her captor. Were Antony serious or disposed to mirth, says Plutarch, she had at any moment some new delight or charm to meet his wishes. At every turn she was upon him, and let him escape her neither by day nor by night. She played at dice with him, drank with him, hunted with him. And when he exercised in arms, she was there to see. As a result of this adventure, Antony divorced his wife, the sister of the Emperor Augustus, which resulted in the emperor's declaring war on Cleopatra. The fleet of Antony and Cleopatra was defeated by that of Augustus when the little queen was 38 years old. She fled from the Romans, followed by her lover, who, on hearing a false report of her death, killed himself. To make Augustus's triumph complete, it was decreed that Cleopatra should be exhibited in Rome, but she thwarted these arrangements. Visiting the monument which sheltered Antony's tomb, she shut herself up therein with only her 2 maids of honor. She wrote to the emperor a letter, making pathetic entreaties that she might be buried in the tomb with Antony. Later, when some soldiers opened the doors of the monument, they found the beautiful Cleopatra dead, lying upon a bed of gold set out in all her royal ornaments. Her 2 maids, by her side, were in a dying condition. As to how Cleopatra met her death has for centuries been one of the riddles of the Sphinx. One story was that just before she shut herself in the tomb, a countryman bearing a basket of figs was allowed to pass the guards and enter her presence with an asp hidden under the fruit. By allowing the serpent to sting her, some say upon the arm, others aver upon the bosom, she is alleged to have committed suicide. According to another account, she kept the asp in a vase, and with a golden spindle tantalized it until it stung her. Another story was that she killed herself with poison carried in a hollow bodkin, upon which she wound her wonderful hair. But it has been argued that if she had chosen any serpent to sting her, it would have been the small viper rather than the large asp. Moreover, it is related that she was found dead without any mark or suspicion of poison on her body, and that a serpent's bite would have left an unmistakable blemish. Many authorities have argued that Cleopatra's vanity would never have allowed her to select a mode of death that would have disfigured her so frightfully as a serpent sting. What really took place is known to no one, says Plutarch. End of Cleopatra. How Did She Die? Recording by Andrea Kotzer.
The Conclave of the Universe by Stanton A. Coblentz. Coffee Break Collection 23. Mysteries, Riddles and Conundrums. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anita Sloma Martinez. The Conclave of the Universe. Far in the deeps of sidereal distance, far where the suns by the million are flying, planets are whirling and comets careering, nebulae swirling in cosmos of light. Once from the corners of infinite vastness floated together the spirits undying, wafted from billions of creatures departing from billions of worlds that revolved through the night. One from each planet, its greatest and wisest, one out of all that had lived in all ages, joined that assemblage of spirits convening far at the uttermost border of space. Long they debated for laws universal, problems eternal were probed by those sages, secrets of life in this struggle it wages, riddles of death and of time and of place. Suns by the cluster and clusters of clusters are blazing about us, the spirits were saying. Galaxies bright whose unthinkable vastness is yet in the cosmos unthinkably small. Myriad worlds with a myriad creatures, loving and hoping and toiling and slaying, battling to live and replenish their species. What is the reason, the goal of it all? Sadly a murmur arose from Orion. Long have we sought, and the gloom is unsounded. Sadly from Vega, and soft from Polaris, voices were calling, we seek but in vain. One from Capella was sighing, no answer, and one from Arcturus, the night is unbounded. Souls from the Pleiades muttered astounded, the darkness can never be cloven in twain. All being helpless to solve the enigma, all flitted back to the realm whence they parted, wisest of all of the infinite billions of beings residing in infinite space. Still as forever the comets went roving, planets gyrated and meteors darted, suns as the sands that are tossed on the storm wind whirled through the void in anarchical race. End of the Conclave of the Universe.
Conscious by Wilfred, Owen. Coffee Break Collection 23. Mysteries, Riddles and Conundrums. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chad Horner from Liverpool. Conscious. His fingers wake and flutter up the bed. His eyes come open with a pull of will, helped by the yellow mayflowers by his head. A blind cord draws across the windowsill. How smooth the floor of the ward is, what a rug. And who's that talking, somewhere out of sight? Why are they laughing? What's inside that jug? Nurse, doctor. Yes, all right. But sudden dusk bewilders all the air. There seems no time to want a drink of water. Nurse looks so far away, and everywhere music and roses burnt through crimson slaughter. Cold, he's cold and yet so hot, and there's no light to see the voices by, no time to dream and ask he knows not what. End of Conscience.
The Disappearance of Dorothy Arnold, from Famous Mysteries, Curious and Fantastic Riddles of Human Life That Have Never Been Solved, by John Elfreth Watkins. Coffee Break Collection 23, Mysteries, Riddles, and Conundrums. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrea Kotzer. The Disappearance of Dorothy Arnold. Christmas night, 1910, the newspapers received their first details of the most baffling disappearance mystery that has vexed the world since the kidnapping of Charlie Ross. 13 days before, on December 12th, Dorothy Harriet Camille Arnold, daughter of Francis R. Arnold, a wealthy perfumery importer, at 11:30 a.m. left her mother at the family residence, 108 East 79th Street, New York, announcing that she was about to visit the Fifth Avenue shops in search of a dress. Promising to call her mother on the telephone as soon as she found something to her taste, she walked from her home to Park and Tilford store at Fifth Avenue and 59th Street, where she purchased a pound of candy. Although she had from $20 to $30 in her pocketbook, she had the confections charged. It was just about noon when she left the candy shop. 2 hours later, she entered Brentano's in 26th Street, where she bought a volume of humorous epigrams entitled An Engaged Girl's Sketches. After emerging from the bookstore at 2:45 p.m., she met a young woman friend who congratulated her upon her healthful appearance. "I am feeling fine," said Miss Arnold, who, turning north, added, "I am going to walk home through Central Park." That was the last trace of Miss Arnold known to her friends or relatives. She was of a wealthy family, proud of its pedigree. Her father traced his ancestry direct to the Pilgrims of Plymouth Rock. She was 26 years old, about 5 feet 4 inches tall, and weighed 140 pounds. Had a fair complexion, dark brown hair, and grayish-blue eyes. All told, she was a girl of striking appearance, the pink of delicacy, dignity, and refinement. She wore a tailor-made blue serge suit and black velvet hat trimmed with 2 silk roses. She carried a black fox muff. She was strong and athletic, extensively traveled, and accustomed to going about alone. She had a very cultured voice, whose accent was described as somewhat like that of a Frenchwoman. She was a Bryn Mawr graduate with literary tastes. Lately she had written a love story entitled Poinsettia Flames, also some verses, Lotus Leaves, which she was endeavoring to have published. She had very conventional tastes, was said to be the last woman in New York who would ever elect to visit the bohemian cafes. She was not interested in the stage, in settlement work, or any fads that would take her out of the paths frequented by conventional people. At the time of her disappearance, she had out invitations for a tea in honor of 60 Bryn Mawr schoolmates. This function was to have been given 5 days after she vanished. A search of her room showed that she had left behind all of her jewelry of value and a large batch of personal letters. Everything indicated that her disappearance had not been premeditated. Had she planned to leave home without taking her parents into her confidence, she would probably have carried off her jewels in order to realize upon them. Had she planned suicide, she would not have purchased sweetmeats and humorous epigrams in the moments directly following a last farewell to her mother. Her clothing being of the finest quality and bearing the labels of the most exclusive modistes, it is inconceivable that her body could have been found without exciting notoriety, unless the discoverers of her remains wished to conceal her fate. Among her friends, she was known to be popular among many men, but sentimentally inclined toward none. Yet the private letters found in her room disclosed one romance. She was apparently about to become engaged to a Pittsburgh bachelor. At first, the Arnold family concealed their daughter's disappearance from the press, But realizing the value of newspaper aid in such an emergency, their attorneys at last gave out a bulletin to the reporters. Thereafter, a series of conflicting statements and retractions served only to deepen the mystery. There was issued the statement that Mrs. Arnold was ensconced in a winter resort awaiting news of her daughter, but investigation showed that she and her son were in Europe. It was stated that Miss Arnold had no love affairs, but the reporters confronted the family's attorney with alleged evidence that she had been carrying on a clandestine correspondence with the Pittsburgh bachelor. In spite of the general belief that Miss Arnold was still alive, her family went into deep mourning for her. Evidence of their absolute ignorance of her whereabouts is the fact that their personal attorney traveled thousands of miles to interview police and detective authorities and visit sanitariums and retreats of all kinds wherein the young woman might be hidden. Virtually every newspaper in the world has published her picture and description. Both the Old World and the New have been scoured for evidences of her fate. Hundreds of thousands of circulars have been sent to postmasters and police officials everywhere, and her picture was flashed upon the screens of hundreds of photo playhouses. Her parents have made several trips to Europe in search of her, and hundreds of thousands of dollars have been spent in trying to answer the riddle of her fate. It has baffled William J. Flynn, head of the United States Secret Service, William J. Burns of the Burns Detective Agency, Sir E.R. Henry, Chief of Scotland Yard, and other of the greatest detectives of the Old and New Worlds. End of The Disappearance of Dorothy Arnold. Recording by Andrea Kotzer.
A Fable by Mark Twain. Coffee Break Collection 23, Mysteries, Riddles and Conundrums. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. A Fable. Once upon a time, an artist who had painted a small and very beautiful picture placed it so that he could see it in the mirror. He said, "This doubles the distance and softens it, and it is twice as lovely as it was before." All the animals out in the woods heard this through the house cat, who was greatly admired by them because he was so learned and so refined and civilized and so polite and high-bred, and could tell them so much which they didn't know before and were not certain about afterward. They were much excited by this new piece of gossip, and they asked questions so as to get at a full understanding of it. They asked what picture it was, and the cat explained. "It is a flat thing," he said, "wonderfully flat, marvelously flat, enchantingly flat and elegant, and oh, so beautiful." That excited them almost to a frenzy, and they said they would give the world to see that. Then the bear asked, "What is it that makes it so beautiful?" "It is the looks of it," said the cat. This filled them with admiration and uncertainty, and they were more excited than ever. Then the cow asked, "What is a mirror?" "It is a hole in the wall," said the cat. "You look in it, and there you see the picture, and it is so dainty and charming and ethereal and inspiring in its unimaginable beauty that your head turns round and round, and you almost swoon with ecstasy." The ass had not said anything as yet. He now began to throw doubts. He said, there had never been anything as beautiful as this before, and probably wasn't now. He said that when it took a whole basketful of sesquipedalian adjectives to whump up such a thing of beauty, it was time for suspicion. It was easy to see that these doubts were having an effect upon the animals. So the cat went off offended. The subject was dropped for a couple of days, but in the meantime curiosity was taking a fresh start, and there was a revival of interest perceptible. Then the animals assailed the ass for spoiling what could possibly have been a pleasure to them, on a mere suspicion that the picture was not beautiful, without any evidence that such was the case. The ass was not troubled. He was calm, and said that there was one way to find out who was in the right, himself or the cat. He would go and look in that hole, and come back and tell what he found there. The animals felt relieved and grateful, and asked him to go at once, which he did. But he did not know where he ought to stand, and so, through error, he stood between the picture and the mirror. The result was that the picture had no chance and didn't show up. He returned home and said, "The cat lied. There was nothing in that hole but an ass. There wasn't a sign of a flat thing visible. It was a handsome ass and friendly, but just an ass and nothing more." The elephant asked, "Did you see it good and clear? Were you close to it?" "I saw it good and clear, O Hathi, king of beasts. I was so close that I touched noses with it." "This is very strange," said the elephant. "The cat was always truthful before, as far as we could make out. Let another witness try. Go, Baloo, look in the hole, and come and report." So the bear went. When he came back, he said, "Both the cat and the ass have lied. There is nothing in the hole but a bear." Great was the surprise and puzzlement of the animals. Each was now anxious to make the test himself and get at the straight truth. The elephant sent them in one at a time. First the cow. She found nothing in the hole but a cow. The tiger found nothing in it but a tiger. The lion found nothing in it but a lion. The leopard found nothing in it but a leopard. The camel found a camel and nothing more. When Hathi was wroth and said he would have the truth if he had to go in and fetch it himself. When he returned, he abused his whole subjectry for liars, and was in an unappeasable fury with the moral and mental blindness of the cat. He said that anybody but a nearsighted fool could see that there was nothing in the hole but an elephant. Moral by the cat. You can find in a text whatever you bring if you will stand between it and the mirror of your imagination. You may not see your ears, but they will be there. End of A Fable by Mark Twain.
How Rome Fell to the Visigoths by Procopius, 500 to 570 A.D. From the History of the Wars, Book 3. Coffee Break Collection 23, Mysteries, Riddles, and Conundrums. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Now while Honorius was holding the imperial power in the west, barbarians took possession of his land, and I shall tell you who they were, and in what manner they did so. There were many Gothic nations in earlier times, just as also at the present, but the greatest and most important of all are the Goths, Vandals, Visigoths, and Gepides. In ancient times, however, they were named Suramate and Melanchthini, and there were some too who called these nations Getic. All these, while they are distinguished from one another by their names, as has been said, do not differ in anything else at all. For they all have white bodies and fair hair, and are tall and handsome to look upon, and they use the same laws and practice a common religion, for they are all of the Arian faith, and have one language called Gothic. And, as it seems to me, they all came originally from one tribe, and were distinguished later by the names of those who led each group. These people used to dwell above the Ister River from of old. Later on, the Gepides got possession of the country of Singidunum and Sirmium, on both sides of the Ister River, where they have remained settled even down to my time. But the Visigoths, separating from the others, removed from there and at first entered into an alliance with the Emperor Arcadius, but at a later time, for faith with the Romans cannot dwell in barbarians, under the leadership of Alaric they became hostile to both emperors, and beginning with Thrace, treated all Europe as an enemy's land. Now the Emperor Honorius had before this time been sitting in Rome, with never a thought of war in his mind, but glad, I think, if men allowed him to remain quiet in his palace. But when word was brought that the barbarians with a great army were not far off, but somewhere among the Tolanti, he abandoned the palace and fled in disorderly fashion to Ravenna, a strong city lying just about at the end of the Ionian Gulf, while some say that he brought in the barbarians himself, because an uprising had been started against him among his subjects. But this does not seem to me trustworthy, as far, at least, as one can judge from the character of the man. The barbarians, finding that they had no hostile force to encounter them, came to be most cruel to all men, for they destroyed all the cities which they captured, especially those south of the Ionian Gulf, so completely that nothing was left to my time to know them by, unless, indeed, it might be one tower or one gate or some such thing which chanced to remain. And they killed all the people, as many as came in their way, both old and young alike, sparing neither women nor children. Wherefore, even up to the present time, Italy is sparsely populated. They also gathered as plunder all the money out of Europe, and, most important of all, they left in Rome nothing whatever of public or private wealth when they moved on to Gaul. But I shall now tell how Alaric captured Rome. After much time had been spent by him in the siege, and he had not been able either by force or by any other device to capture the place, he formed the following plan. Among the youths in the army whose beards had not yet grown, but who had just come of age, he chose out 300 whom he knew to be of good birth and possessed of valor beyond their years, and told them secretly that he was about to make a present of them to certain of the patricians in Rome, pretending that they were slaves. And he instructed them that, as soon as they got inside the houses of those men, they should display much gentleness and moderation, and serve them eagerly in whatever tasks should be laid upon them by their owners. And he further directed them that not long afterwards, on an appointed day at about midday, when all those who were to be their masters would most likely be already asleep after their meal, they should all come to the gate called Salarian, and with a sudden rush kill the guards, who would have no previous knowledge of the plot, and open the gates as quickly as possible. After giving these orders to the youths, Alaric straightway sent ambassadors to the members of the Senate, stating that he admired them for their loyalty toward their emperor, and that he would trouble them no longer, because of their valor and faithfulness, with which it was plain that they were endowed to a remarkable degree. And in order that tokens of himself might be preserved among men, both noble and brave, he wished to present each one of them with some domestics. After making this declaration, and sending the youths not long afterwards, he commanded the barbarians to make preparations for the departure, and he let this be known to the Romans. And they heard his words gladly, and receiving his gifts began to be exceedingly happy, since they were completely ignorant of the plot of the barbarian. For the youth, by being unusually obedient to their owners, averted suspicion, and in the camp some were already seen moving from their positions and raising the siege, while it seemed that the others were just on the point of doing the very same thing. But when the appointed day had come, Alaric armed his whole force for the attack, and was holding them in readiness close by the Salarian gate, for it happened that he had encamped there at the beginning of the siege. And all the youths, at the time of the day agreed upon, came to this gate, and assailing the guard suddenly, put them to death. Then they opened the gates, and received Alaric and the army into the city at their leisure. And they set fire to the houses which were next to the gate, among which was also the house of Sallust, who in ancient times wrote the history of the Romans, and the greater part of this house had stood, half burned up to my time. And after plundering the whole city, and destroying the most of the Romans, they moved on. And at that time they say that the Emperor Honorius in Ravenna received the message from one of the eunuchs, evidently a keeper of the poultry, that Rome had perished. And he cried out and said, "And yet it has just eaten from my hands." For he had a very large cock, Rome by name, and the eunuch, comprehending his words, said that it was the city of Rome which had perished at the hands of Alaric. And the emperor, with a sigh of relief, answered quickly, "But I, my good fellow, thought that my foul Rome had perished." So great, they say, was the folly with which this emperor was possessed. But some say that Rome was not captured in this way by Alaric, but that Proba, a woman of very unusual eminence in wealth and in fame among the Roman senatorial class, felt pity for the Romans, who were being destroyed by hunger and the other suffering they endured, for they were already even tasting each other's flesh. And seeing that every good hope had left them, since both the river and the harbor were held by the enemy, she commanded her domestics, they say, to open the gates by night. End of How Rome Fell to the Visigoths by Procopius.
Jack the Ripper, from Famous Mysteries, Curious and Fantastic Riddles of Human Life That Have Never Been Solved, by John Elfreth Watkins. Coffee Break Collection 23, Mysteries, Riddles, and Conundrums. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrea Kotzer. Jack the Ripper. There was a reign of terror in London's Whitechapel district during the late 80s. On Christmas 1887, a woman of the demimonde was brutally murdered and mutilated. And during 1888, 7 more crimes of the same character added to the frenzy of underworld denizens. Again, in 1889, 2 more victims were found, and early in 1891, a 12th. All of the victims were of the class known as streetwalkers, and all bore the same unmistakable marks of brutality. The throat of each was cut, and each body upon which the murderer apparently had had time to complete his butchery was eviscerated in the same manner. It was the methodical work of some fiend, maniac, or monster who seemed to possess a knowledge of surgery and anatomy. He always managed to escape, and apparently there was no motive except a revolting appetite for butchery or thirst for revenge. Seemingly he had no ill will against, or personal knowledge of, his victims, each of whom was of a class that he knew would place herself voluntarily at his mercy and would unconsciously assist him in avoiding danger of detection. On the 30th of September, 1888, the monster murdered 2 of his victims, one immediately after the other. The fact that the first whom he killed was not mutilated in the usual way indicated that he had been interrupted before completing his bloody work. And being thus disturbed before satisfying his mania for mutilation in the accustomed way, he ran out and completed his work upon the next victim whom he could find. The police were nonplussed from the start. The fiend appeared to change his lodgings after each murder. Some newspaper scribe dubbed the monster Jack the Ripper, and the name was soon upon every tongue throughout both Europe and America. It sent shivers down the spines of Londoners, and for a long time limited the activities of the class among whom the maniac selected his victims. The authorities being unable to obtain a single clue, numerous private citizens enlisted as detectives. Even one of the autocratic directors of the Bank of London disguised himself as a laborer, and in heavy boots and fustian jacket, with a red bandana tied about his head and a pickaxe over his shoulder, sought diversion each night haunting neighborhoods in which he imagined Jack the Ripper would appear. The distinguished criminologist, L. Forbes Winslow, spent night after night in the Whitechapel slums seeking the slayer, and at one time inserted in the London papers an advertisement stating that a gentleman strongly opposed to the presence of fallen women in the streets of London would like to cooperate in their suppression. By this means, Dr. Winslow hoped to get into correspondence with the maniac, and he received several confessions in the same handwriting. Each expressed insane glee over the hideous work, and one stated that the next murder would be committed on November 9th. The fact that this prophecy was brutally fulfilled led the doctor to believe that he had been in correspondence with Jack the Ripper himself, although previously he had suspected that someone was hoaxing him. On the day prophesied, the body of Mary Ann Kelly, with throat cut and body eviscerated, was found on a ground-floor room with an uncurtained window through which any passer-by might have seen the crime, which had been committed in broad daylight. In the handwriting of Dr. Winslow's correspondent was at last found beneath an archway the statement, "Jack the Ripper will never commit another murder." And this prophecy also seems to have been fulfilled. Every investigator of the crimes had his own theory as to Jack the Ripper's character. He was variously believed to be an escaped guerrilla, a Russian discharged from a Paris asylum, a man from Vienna who, in a London hospital, had complained of having been robbed by a streetwalker, and who, after threatening to kill all such women, had exhibited surgical interest by asking to witness various operations, and a sufferer from masked epilepsy, who during his chronic seizures would perform the most diabolical acts, but who on returning to consciousness was in entire ignorance of his crimes. Because the slaughterhouse was found to be in close proximity to each spot in which a victim was found, one investigator, applying the law of deduction, argued that Jack the Ripper was a butcher, and on the strength of this theory several detectives disguised as slaughtermen went to work in these establishments. One theory was that the murderer was a woman disguised as a slaughterman. The belief of Dr. Winslow is that Jack the Ripper was a man of position and means, a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde phenomenon suffering from a religious monomania, and who, while his paroxysms lasted, was bent on exterminating fallen women, but who, when these seizures passed off, returned to the bosom of his family, probably in the West End of London. The favorite theory has been that Jack the Ripper practiced his butchery in revenge for having contracted from a woman of Whitechapel an incurable disease which had undermined his health and unhinged his reason. Who he was and why he plied his hideous trade is the Sphinx riddle of criminology. End of Jack the Ripper. Recording by Andrea Kotzer.
Madness by Rainer Maria Rilke. Coffee Break Collection 23. Mysteries, Riddles and Conundrums. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chad Horner from Liverpool. Madness. She thinks, I am. Have you not seen? Who are you then, Marie? I am a queen. I am a queen. To your knee, and then she weeps. I was a child. Who were you then, Marie? Know you that I was no man's child? Poor and in rags, said she. And then a princess I became, to whom men bend their knees. To princes things are not the same as those a beggar sees. And those things which have made you great came to you, tell me when. One night quite late, things became different then. I walked with strung chords seemed to bend. Then Marie became melody and danced from end to end. The people watched with startled mien and passed with frightened glance. For all know that only a queen may dance in the lanes. Dance. End of Madness.
Chapter 7 of Alice in Wonderland, A Mad Tea Party by Lewis Carroll. Coffee Break Collection 23, Mysteries, Riddles and Conundrums. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in October 2019. A Mad Tea Party. There was a table set out under a tree in front of the house, and the March Hare and the Hatter were having tea at it. A dormouse was sitting between them, fast asleep, and the other two were using it as a cushion, resting their elbows on it, and talking over its head. Very uncomfortable for the dormouse, thought Alice, only as it's asleep, I suppose it doesn't mind. The table was a large one, but the three were all crowded together at one corner of it. No room, they cried out when they saw Alice coming. There's plenty of room, said Alice indignantly, and she sat down in the large armchair at one end of the table. Have some wine, the March Hare said in an encouraging tone. Alice looked all around the table, but there was nothing on it but tea. I don't see any wine, she remarked. There isn't any, said the March Hare. Then it wasn't very civil of you to offer it, said Alice angrily. It wasn't very civil of you to sit down without being invited, said the March Hare. I didn't know it was your table, said Alice. It's laid for a great many more than three. Your hair wants cutting, said the Hatter. He had been looking at Alice for some time with great curiosity, and this was his first speech. You should learn not to make personal remarks, Alice said with some severity. It's very rude. The Hatter opened his eyes very wide on hearing this, but all he said was, Why is a raven like a writing desk? Come, we shall have some fun now, thought Alice. I'm glad they've begun asking riddles. I believe I can guess that, she added aloud. Do you mean you think you can find out the answer to it? Said the March Hare. Exactly so, said Alice. Then you should say what you mean, the March Hare went on. I do, Alice replied hastily. At least, I mean what I say. That's the same thing, you know. Not the same thing a bit, said the Hatter. You might just as well say that I see what I eat is the same thing as I eat what I see. You might just as well say, added the March Hare, that I like what I get is the same thing as I get what I like. You might just as well say, added the Dormouse, who seemed to be talking in his sleep, that I breathe when I sleep is the same thing as I sleep when I breathe. It is the same thing with you, said the Hatter, and here the conversation dropped, and the party sat silent for a minute while Alice thought over all she could remember about ravens and writing desks, which wasn't much. The Hatter was the first to break the silence. "What day of the month is it?" he said, turning to Alice. He had taken his watch out of his pocket and was looking at it uneasily, shaking it every now and then, and holding it to his ear. Alice considered a little and then said, "The 4th." "2 days wrong," sighed the Hatter. "I told you butter wouldn't suit the works," he added, looking angrily at the March Hare. "It was the best butter," the March Hare meekly replied. "Yes, but some crumbs must have got in as well," the Hatter grumbled. "You shouldn't have put it in with the bread knife." The March Hare took the watch and looked at it gloomily. Then he dipped it into his cup of tea, and looked at it again, but he could think of nothing better to say than his first remark. "It was the best butter, you know." Alice had been looking over his shoulder with some curiosity. "What a funny watch," she remarked. "It tells the day of the month, and doesn't tell what o'clock it is." "Why should it?" muttered the Hatter. "Does your watch tell you what year it is?" "Of course not," Alice replied very readily, "but that's because it stays the same year for such a long time together." "Which is just the case with mine," said the Hatter. Alice felt dreadfully puzzled. The Hatter's remark seemed to have no sort of meaning in it, and yet it was certainly English. "I don't quite understand you," she said, as politely as she could. "The dormouse is asleep again," said the Hatter, and he poured a little hot tea upon its nose. The dormouse shook its head impatiently and said without opening its eyes, of course, just what I was going to remark myself." "Have you guessed the riddle yet?" the Hatter said, turning to Alice again. "No, I give up," Alice replied. "What's the answer?" "I haven't the slightest idea," said the Hatter. "Nor I," said the March Hare. Alice sighed wearily. "I think you might do something better with the time," she said, "than waste it in asking riddles that have no answers." "If you knew time as well as I do," said the Hatter, "you wouldn't talk about wasting it. It's him." "And I don't know what you mean," said Alice. "Of course you don't," the Hatter said, tossing his head contemptuously. "I dare say you never even spoke to time." "Perhaps not," Alice cautiously replied, "but I know I have to beat time when I learn music." "Ah, that accounts for it," said the Hatter. "He won't stand beating. Now, if you only keep on good terms with him, he'd do almost anything you liked with the clock. For instance, suppose it were 9 o'clock in the morning, just time to begin lessons. You'd only have to whisper a hint to time, and round goes the clock in a twinkling. 1:30, time for dinner." "I only wish it was," the March Hare said to itself in a whisper. "That would be grand, certainly," said Alice thoughtfully. "But then I shouldn't be hungry for it, you know." "Not at first, perhaps," said the Hatter, "but you could keep it to 1:30 as long as you liked." "Is that the way you manage?" Alice asked. The Hatter shook his head mournfully. "Not I," he replied. "We quarreled last March, just before he went mad, you know," pointing with his teaspoon at the March Hare. "It was at the great concert given by the Queen of Hearts, and I had to sing, 'Twinkle, twinkle, little bat, how I wonder where you're at.' You know the song, perhaps?" "I've heard something like it," said Alice. "It goes on, you know," the Hatter continued, "in this way. Up above the world you fly, like a tea-tray in the sky, twinkle, twinkle." Here the dormouse shook himself and began singing in its sleep, "Twinkle, twinkle, twinkle, twinkle," and went on so long that they had to pinch it to make it stop. "Well, I'd hardly finished the first verse," said the Hatter, "when the Queen jumped up and bawled out, 'He's murdering the time! Off with his head!'" "How dreadfully savage!" exclaimed Alice. "And ever since that," the Hatter went on in a mournful tone, "he won't do a thing I ask. It's always 6 o'clock now." A bright idea came into Alice's head. "Is that the reason so many tea things are put out here?" she asked. "Yes, that's it," said the Hatter with a sigh. "It's always tea time, and we've no time to wash the things between whiles." "Then you keep moving around, I suppose," said Alice. "Exactly so," said the Hatter, "as the things get used up." "But what happens when you come to the beginning again?" Alice ventured to ask. "Suppose we change the subject," the March Hare interrupted, yawning. "I'm getting tired of this. I vote the young lady tells us a story." "I'm afraid I don't know one," said Alice, rather alarmed at the proposal. "Then the Dormouse shall," they both cried. "Wake up, Dormouse!" And they pinched it on both sides at once. The Dormouse slowly opened his eyes. "I wasn't asleep," he said in a hoarse, feeble voice. "I heard every word you fellows were saying." "Tell us a story," said the March Hare. "Yes, please do," pleaded Alice. "And be quick about it," added the Hatter, "or you'll be asleep again before it's done." "Once upon a time there were 3 little sisters," the Dormouse began in a great hurry, "and their names were Elsie, Lacie, and Tilly, and they lived at the bottom of a well." "What did they live on?" said Alice, who always took a great interest in questions of eating and drinking. "They lived on treacle," said the Dormouse, after thinking a minute or two. "They couldn't have done that, you know," Alice gently remarked. "They'd have been ill." "So they were," said the Dormouse, "very ill." Alice tried to fancy to herself what such an extraordinary way of living would be like, but it puzzled her too much, and so she went on. "But why did they live at the bottom of a well?" "Take some more tea," the March Hare said to Alice very earnestly. "I've had nothing yet," Alice replied in an offended tone, "so I can't take more." "You mean you can't take less," said the Hatter. "It's very easy to take more than nothing." "Nobody asked your opinion," said Alice. "Who's making personal remarks now?" the Hatter asked triumphantly. Alice did not quite know what to say to this, so she helped herself to some tea and bread and butter, and then turned to the Dormouse and repeated her question. Why did they live at the bottom of a well? The Dormouse again took a minute or two to think about it, and then he said, "It was a treacle well." "There's no such thing," Alice was beginning very angrily, but the Hatter and March Hare went, "Shh! Shh!" and the Dormouse sulkily remarked, "If you can't be civil, you'd better finish the story for yourself." "No, please go on," Alice said very humbly. "I won't interrupt again. I dare say there may be one." "One indeed," said the Dormouse indignantly. However, he consented to go on. "And so these 3 little sisters, they were learning to draw, you know." "What did they draw?" Alice said, quite forgetting her promise. "Treacle," said the Dormouse, without considering at all this time. "I want a clean cup," interrupted the Hatter. "Let's all move one place on." He moved on as he spoke, and the Dormouse followed him. The March Hare moved into the Dormouse's place, and Alice, rather unwillingly, took the place of the March Hare. The Hatter was the only one who got any advantage from the change, and Alice was a good deal worse off than before, as the March Hare had just upset the milk jug into his plate. Alice did not wish to offend the Dormouse again, so she began very cautiously. "But I don't understand. Where did they draw the treacle from?" "You can draw water out of a water well," said the Hatter. "So I should think you could draw treacle out of a treacle well, stupid?" "But they were in the well," Alice said to the Dormouse, not choosing to notice this last remark. "Of course they were," said the Dormouse. "Well in." This answer so confused poor Alice that she let the Dormouse go on for some time without interrupting it. "They were learning to draw," the Dormouse went on, yawning and rubbing its eyes, for it was getting very sleepy, "and they drew all manner of things, everything that begins with an M." "Why with an M?" said Alice. "Why not?" said the March Hare. Alice was silent. The Dormouse had closed its eyes by this time and was going off into a doze, but on being pinched by the Hatter, it woke up again with a little shriek and went on. "That begins with an M, such as mousetraps, and the moon, and memory, and muchness. You know, you say things are much of a muchness. Did you ever see such a thing as a drawing of a muchness? Really, now you ask me, said Alice, very much confused. I don't think. Then you shouldn't talk, said the Hatter. This piece of rudeness was more than Alice could bear. She got up in great disgust and walked off. The Dormouse fell asleep instantly, and neither of the others took the least notice of her going, though she looked back once or twice, half hoping that they would call after her. The last time she saw them, they were trying to put the Dormouse into the teapot. At any rate, I'll never go there again, said Alice, as she picked her way through the wood. It's the stupidest tea-party I ever was at in all my life. Just as she said this, she noticed that one of the trees had a door leading right into it. That's very curious, she thought, but everything's curious today. I think I may as well go in at once. And in she went. Once more she found herself in the long hall and close to the little glass table. Now I'll manage better this time, she said to herself, and began by taking the little golden key and unlocking the door that led into the garden. Then she went to work nibbling at the mushroom. She had kept a piece of it in her pocket till she was about a foot high. Then she walked down the little passage, and then she found herself at last in the beautiful garden, among the bright flower beds and the cool fountains. End of Chapter 7 of Alice in Wonderland, A Mad Tea Party.
Mr. Bloke's Item by Mark Twain. Coffee Break Collection 23, Mysteries, Riddles and Conundrums. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anita Sloma Martinez. Mr. Bloke's Item. Our esteemed friend, Mr. John William Bloke of Virginia City, walked into the office where we are sub-editor at a late hour last night, with an expression of profound and heartfelt suffering upon his countenance, and sighing heavily, laid the following item reverently upon the desk, and walked slowly out again. He paused a moment at the door, and seemed struggling to command his feelings sufficiently to enable him to speak, and then, nodding his head toward his manuscript, ejaculated in a broken voice, "Friend of mine, oh, how sad!" and burst into tears. We were so moved at his distress that we did not think to call him back and endeavor to comfort him until he was gone, and it was too late. The paper had already gone to press, but knowing that our friend would consider the publication of this item important, and cherishing the hope that to print it would afford a melancholy satisfaction to his sorrowing heart, we stopped the press at once and inserted it in our columns. Distressing accident. Last evening about 6 o'clock, as Mr. William Schuyler, an old and respectable citizen of South Park, was leaving his residence to go downtown, as been his usual custom for many years, with the exception only of a short interval in the spring of 1850, during which he was confined to his bed by injuries received in attempting to stop a runaway horse by thoughtlessly placing himself directly in its wake and throwing up his hands and shouting, which if he had done so even a single moment sooner, must inevitably have frightened the animal still more, instead of checking its speed, although disastrous enough to himself as it was, and rendered more melancholy and distressing by reason of the presence of his wife's mother, who was there and saw the sad occurrence. Notwithstanding, it is at least likely, though not necessarily so, that she should be reconnoitering in another direction when incidents occur, not being vivacious and on the lookout as a general thing, but even the reverse, as her own mother is said to have stated, who is no more, but died in the full hope of a glorious resurrection upwards of 3 years ago, aged 86, being a Christian woman and without guile, as it were, or property, in consequence of the fire of 1849, which destroyed every single thing she had in the world. But such is life. Let us all take warning by this solemn occurrence, and let us endeavor so to conduct ourselves that when we come to die we can do it. Let us place our hands upon our heart and say with earnestness and sincerity that from this day forth we will beware of the intoxicating bowl. First edition of the Californian. The head editor has been in here raising the mischief and tearing his hair and kicking the furniture about and abusing me like a pickpocket. He says that every time he leaves me in charge of the paper for half an hour, I get imposed upon by the first infant or the first idiot that comes along. And he says that that distressing item of Mr. Bloke's is nothing but a lot of distressing bosh, and has no point to it, and no sense in it, and no information in it, and that there was no sort of necessity for stopping the press to publish it. Now all this comes of being good-hearted. If I had been as unaccommodating and unsympathetic as some people, I would have told Mr. Bloke that I wouldn't receive his communication at such a late hour. But no, his snuffling distress touched my heart, and I jumped at the chance of doing something to modify his misery. I never read his item to see whether there was anything wrong about it, but hastily wrote the few lines which preceded it and sent it to the printers. And what has my kindness done for me? It has done nothing but bring down upon me a storm of abuse and ornamental blasphemy. Now I will read that item myself, and see if there is any foundation for all this fuss, and if there is, the author of it shall hear from me. I have read it, and I am bound to admit that it seems a little mixed at a first glance. However, I will peruse it once more. I have read it again, and it does really seem a good deal more mixed than ever. I have read it over 5 times, but if I can get at the meaning of it, I wish I may get my just deserts. It won't bear analysis. There are things about it which I cannot understand at all. It don't say whatever became of William Schuyler. It just says enough about him to get one interested in his career and then drops him. Who is William Schuyler anyhow? And what part of South Park did he live in? And if he started downtown at 6 o'clock, did he ever get there? And if he did anything happen to him? Is he the individual that met with a distressing accident? Considering the elaborate circumstantiality of detail observable in the item, it seems to me that it ought to contain more information than it does. On the contrary, it is obscure, and not only obscure, but utterly incomprehensible. Was the breaking of Mr. Schuyler's leg 15 years ago the distressing accident that plunged Mr. Bloke into unspeakable grief and caused him to come up here at dead of night and stop our press to acquaint the world with the circumstance? Or did the distressing accident consist in the destruction of Schuyler's mother-in-law's property in early times? Or did it consist in the death of that person herself 3 years ago, albeit it does not appear that she died by accident? In a word, what did that distressing accident consist in? What did that drivelling ass of a Schuyler stand in the wake of a runaway horse for, with his shouting and gesticulating if he wanted to stop him? And how the mischief could he get run over by a horse that had already passed beyond him? And what are we to take warning by? And how is this extraordinary chapter of incomprehensibilities going to be a lesson to us? And above all, what has the intoxicating bowl got to do with it anyhow? It is not stated that Schuyler drank, or that his wife drank, or that his mother-in-law drank, or that the horse drank. Wherefore, then, the reference to the intoxicating bowl? It does seem to me that if Mr. Bloke had let the intoxicating bowl alone himself, he never would get into so much trouble about this exasperating imaginary accident. I have read this absurd item over and over again, with all its insinuating plausibility, until my head swims, but I can make neither head nor tail of it. There certainly seems to have been an accident of some kind or other, but it is impossible to determine what the nature of it was, or who was the sufferer by it. I do not like to do it, but I feel compelled to request that the next time anything happens to one of Mr. Bloke's friends, he will append such explanatory notes to his account of it as will enable me to find out what sort of an accident it was and to whom it happened. I had rather all his friends should die than that I should be driven to the verge of lunacy again in trying to cipher out the meaning of another such production as the above. End of Mr. Bloke's item.
The Mysterious Origin of Fires, by James Scott. Coffee Break Collection 23. Mysteries, Riddles and Conundrums. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mysterious Origin of Fires. Outbreaks of fire are often most mysterious in their origin. We are frequently confronted with problems concerning the cause of fires in houses, factories and fields that are utterly baffling and insoluble. Yet in what simple ways we may be victimized, the examples given in this article afford most striking proof. A man may leave his house untenanted for a few moments, and almost before he has passed beyond sight of it, the flames will have broken out in the most bewildering manner. A haystack may catch fire and involve in suspicion the last person known to have been near it. Natural spontaneous combustion will often be responsible for such a crisis, and I have heard of one case in which a box of matches, unintentionally left by a haymaker in the middle of a stack, acted as the centre of a conflagration. In the cases now illustrated, the enemy was caught in the act, but in every example, had it not been discovered just in time, there would have been another mystery added to the long list, for who could have conjectured the curious origins as they are here set forth? It was my own experience to observe the suspicious movements of a reel of thread in this dangerous connection, and, indeed, the transaction suggested the preparation of this article. A newly obtained reel of linen thread had been placed on a mantel-shelf. Thousands of people must be doing such a thing continually, and I noticed that the springiness of the unfastened thread caused a mass of it to be raised above the reel, when it tumbled forward and gradually unwound its coils, lowering its waving extremity nearer and nearer to a coal fire, the draught of which sucked it towards the flame. A tiny spark was engendered, and this rose rather prettily along the glossy line until it reached the sharp edge of the mantel-shelf, when it became extinguished. This danger was obliterated, but suppose that the shelf, as is often the case, had borne a fringe of some inflammable material. This would assuredly have ignited, and would probably have spread the flames over the entire room. It may be noted that the smoothness and springiness of a reel of linen thread is very different from the clinging surface of a reel of cotton thread. It is the simplest natural operation, when lighting a candle, to place the box of matches close at hand in the vicinity of the candlestick. The doing of this trifling act nearly resulted, one summer time, in a catastrophe. Everyone must have seen how limp and helpless a candle will become on a warm summer's evening, and it was on account of this weakness in the candle that the danger arose. Little by little it drooped towards the slightly open box of safety matches, into which it at length plunged its flame, causing a sudden burst of fire, accentuated by the presence of the warm wax which had fallen from the inverted extremity. The table carried several odds and ends of the character generally to be found on a workman's kitchen table, and had the outbreak not been immediately extinguished, the whole place might soon have been alight, to the marvel of its inhabitants. A specimen of frustrated danger arising from a gas bracket may very appropriately come next. One could hardly foresee that in placing a child's woolen ball and bat on a shelf above a gas jet, a possibility was aroused of setting fire to the premises, although, when such a transaction as that is sketched in detail, extra careful people might be led to suspect that the idea of danger would have occurred to them. The gas bracket, however, might have been at right angles to the wall when the things were placed on the shelf, and then later on have been thoughtlessly pushed back by someone else. At any rate, the ball, under the impulse of a gust from an open window, was seen to roll off, first cannoning slightly against the wall, so receiving sufficient impetus to jerk it over the gas globe, into which it fell, with the result that falling pieces of fired wool were quickly being blown helter-skelter all over the apartment, where they might have inflicted extensive damage if they had remained unchecked in their flight. A scullery maid, or anyone else for that matter, would not think twice about placing a box of matches on the ledge of a sink, even in the event of a lamp being situated at a lower level on a stool nearby. Now, in the following case, the combination of circumstances was indeed remarkable. The waste pipe was stopped up, so that the water dripping from the tap slowly filled up the sink. When the water had risen to the level of the ledge, it gracefully tilted the matchbox, which fell straight onto the top of the lamp chimney, shedding its fiery contents into the flare, and, of course, considerably endangering surrounding articles. Fortunately, matters went no farther, but I am justified in supposing that, had they done so, all concerned would soon have been asking, "How did it start?" without having the remotest chance of the truth dawning upon their minds. Moths and flames are universally connected, yet few people suspect that danger could arise therefrom. The insects are of such frail structure that generally they get destroyed before it is possible for them to inflict injury, and it is hardly credible that the wings would ignite and retain the flame long enough to enable the moth to fly to its surroundings. That, however, is what occurred on the following occasion. The moth was a large one, and its wings must have been very dry, so that when it floundered through the flame it set fire to one wing and darted onto a curtain near by, which at once flared up. It is possible that many summer evening fires in the country could be attributed to a source of this kind. It is notorious that mysterious fires often arise at sunset in the hot months. In this case the adherent wax may have helped the wings to keep alight. The last of our examples is certainly the most extraordinary of them all. A box of lucifers had been thrown upon the mantel-shelf, and an American clock evidently put in front of them at a later period, so close as to be in actual contact. Eventually the key drop on the back, during its slow revolutions, had managed effectually to pinch in and hold the matches tightly between itself and the shelf, and the continual pressure and friction on the heads resulted in their ignition, which soon extended to their companions. One might vainly try to repeat a performance successfully accomplished by chance. Everyone has seen or heard of haphazard occurrences which could never be repeated, however carefully attempted. Something sticks in a comical position when thrown, something else undergoes peculiar manoeuvres, but never again is it likely to occur, either by accident or design. End of The Mysterious Origin of Fires.
(1619) and the Negro in Virginia by C. Braxton Bryan. Coffee Break Collection 23, Mysteries, Riddles, and Conundrums. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1619 and the Negro in Virginia. A paper read before the Diocesan Council in Petersburg, Virginia, June 1904. It is generally stated that the first Negroes brought to Virginia were 20 in number, and that they were brought about the 1st of September, 1619, in a Dutch ship which came to Jamestown, and sold them or traded them for provisions. But the records of the Virginia Company and the English state papers show conclusively that the 20 Negroes who actually arrived at that time were brought not by a Dutch ship, but by a famous English ship, the Treasurer, which belonged to Lord Rich, the Earl of Warwick, and others who were interested in the colony. The Treasurer had been cruising in the West Indies and had captured a Spanish ship and taken her cargo. these Negroes, among other things. It was an act not much, if any, short of piracy, as there was peace between England and Spain. It is true that a man-of-war of Flushing did come into Jamestown in consort with the treasurer, and it was convenient to give it out that the Negroes had come in her, but it afterwards transpired that they certainly came in the treasurer, and Lord Rich had trouble enough explaining the action of his ship. The captain of the ship, having the Negroes on his hands, left a part of them in the Bermudas, where Lord Rich had a plantation, and 20 were left at Jamestown. The captain was not looking for Negroes, and it was an accident that they were found in the captured Spanish ship, and so brought to Virginia. But neither were there any scruples about taking them, as Lord Rich had already received a charter from King James, authorizing himself and about 40 other prominent Englishmen to engage in the Guinea and Binney trade on the coast of Africa. In this way the Negro began to be introduced, but very few at first. In February 1624 there were only 22 Negroes in Virginia. In a muster of the plantation in Elizabeth City County, the Corporation of Elizabeth City, as it was then called, in June 1625, there were but 3 Negroes in the population of 345. These were 2 of the original 20, named Antony and Isabel. Their child, born in Virginia, was named William, probably after the owner, Captain William Tucker, who was commander of the corporation. This child was baptized. The list of the living and dead in Virginia at this period shows that, apart from the massacre of 1622, about 25% of the population died year by year of sickness. While the interesting fact is also disclosed that not only were no Negroes killed by the Indians in the massacre, but only 1 Negro had died, although 3 more had been imported, making 22 Negroes in Virginia in February 1624. This afforded a strong motive for the introduction of more Negroes, which was gradually acted upon. Captain Tucker had also an Indian servant named William Cranshaw, after a distinguished clergyman in England who was a great friend of the colony. This Indian was also baptized. His Indian name had been Kupanki. Thus the first recorded baptisms of this parish are of an Indian and a Negro child. There were 3 ministers of the gospel in Elizabeth City about this time: Reverend George Keith, from 1617 until 1625, Reverend Jonas Stockton, 1621 to 1628, and Reverend Mr. Bolton, 1621 to 1623. Which of them had the privilege of baptizing this Indian and this Negro child? Probably the first Negro born in Virginia cannot now be told. 1 other Negro child is recorded as being in James City in 1625. Negroes had been taken to the Bermudas by the English 3 years before they were brought to Virginia, i.e., in the summer of 1616. End of 1619, and the Negro in Virginia.
On Teaching by Khalil Gibran, Coffee Break Collection 23, Mysteries, Riddles and Conundrums. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chad Horner from Liverpool. On Teaching. Then said a teacher, Speak to us of teaching. And he said, No man can reveal to you aught but that which already lies half asleep in the dawning of your knowledge. The teacher who walks in the shadow of the temple among his followers gives not of his wisdom, but rather of his faith and his lovingness. If he is indeed wise, he does not bid you enter the house of his wisdom, but rather leads you to the threshold of your own mind. The astronomer may speak to you of his understanding of space, but he cannot give you his understanding. The musician may sing to you of the rhythm which is in all space, but he cannot give you the ear which arrests the rhythm, nor the voice that echoes it. And he who is versed in the science of numbers can tell of the regions of weight and measure, but he cannot conduct you thither, for the vision of one man lends not its wings to another man. And even as each of you stands alone in God's knowledge, so must each one of you be alone in his knowledge of God and in his understanding of the earth. End of On Teaching.
The Smart Mystery by Anonymous, from the New York Times, January 8, 1913. Coffee Break Collection 23, Mysteries, Riddles, and Conundrums. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. The Smart Mystery. A young man of 20 years and a girl of 18 were the objects of a great deal of sympathy when the Titanic went down last April. They were the children, according to gossip, of James Montgomery Smart, who perished in the wreck. Orphaned and desolate, somewhere in Europe, where they were supposed to be finishing their education, the hearts of the multitude went out to them. Through the American consuls in Europe, a persistent search was made for them, without avail. It is clear that they did not read the newspapers, however intelligent they might be. Neither did they dwell among people who kept in touch with the news of the day. We had been accustoming ourselves to say that the world is very small, but it seemed large in view of the seeming fact that 2 full-grown children of a man who had died in a disaster which had shocked all mankind, and had left property, could not be located or identified. They were, to be sure, found, or nearly found, last August in Belgium, and it was learned then that their names were George and Annie. But this was like the innumerable discoveries of Dorothy Arnold. Nothing more was heard of it. The year of the Titanic disaster ended, leaving the Smart heirs among the missing. The mystery seemed impenetrable. Perhaps it was solved Monday, when the will of James Montgomery Smart was filed for probate. It mentions no children. After providing for the payment of the testator's debts, the estate is divided between 2 of his friends in Australia. It is a natural inference that he had no children, that George and Annie Smart never had any more bodily existence than the children of gentle Elia's dream, that they belong, like the unicorn and Washington's cherry tree, to mythology. But the origin of the Smart children legend might be traced. Perhaps one gossiping person, no, not necessarily a woman, may have confused Mr. Smart with another man of the same name or another name. But a legend often has slighter foundation than that. It seems that all the persons who have given testimony since the wreck as to the existence of Smart's children now say that they never heard him speak of them. Anyhow, he had made a will ignoring them, and the will, though dated in 1897, some years before his wife is supposed to have died, ignores her, too. Did he ever have a wife? The sympathetic gossips have made Smart a man of mystery. But it is likely that there is no other mystery left in his case except that ancient, unsolvable mystery as to why so many people will talk confidently about matters of which they know nothing at all. End of The Smart Mystery.
The Strange Escape of the King's Jester, A Puzzling Adventure by Henry Ernest Dedaney. Coffee Break Collection 23, Mysteries, Riddles, and Conundrums. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Strange Escape of the King's Jester, A Puzzling Adventure. This puzzle is called The Mysterious Rope. At one time I was greatly in favor with the king, and his majesty never seemed to weary of the companionship of the court fool. I had a gift for making riddles and quaint puzzles which ofttimes caused great sport, for albeit the king never found the right answer of one of these things in all his life, yet would he make merry at the bewilderment of those about him. But let every cobbler stick unto his last, for when I did set out to learn the art of performing strange tricks in the magic, wherein the hand doth ever deceive the eye, the king was affrighted, and did accuse me of being a wizard, even commanding that I should be put to death. Luckily my wit did save my life. I begged that I might be slain by the royal hand, and not by that of the executioner. By the saints, said his majesty, what difference can it make unto thee? But since it is thy wish, thou shalt have the choice whether I kill thee or the executioner. Your majesty, I answered, I accept the choice that thou hast so graciously offered to me. I prefer that your majesty should kill the executioner. Yet is the life of a royal jester beset with great dangers, and the king having once gotten it into his royal head that I was a wizard, it was not long before I again fell into trouble, from which my wit did not a second time in a like way save me. I was cast into the dungeon to await my death. How, by the help of my gift in answering riddles and puzzles, I did escape from captivity, I will now set forth, and in case it doth perplex any to know how some of the strange feats were performed, I will hereafter make the manner thereof plain to all. My dungeon did not lie beneath the moat, but was in one of the most high parts of the castle. So stout was the door, and so well locked and secured withal, that escape that way was not to be found. By hard work I did, after many days, remove one of the bars from the narrow window, and was able to crush my body through the opening. But the distance to the courtyard below was so exceedingly great that it was certain death to drop thereto. Yet by great good fortune did I find in the corner of the cell a rope that had been there left, and lay hid in the great darkness. But this rope had not length enough, and to drop in safety from the end was nowise possible. Then did I remember how the wise man from Ireland did lengthen the blanket that was too short for him, by cutting a yard off the bottom of the same, and joining it on to the top. So I made haste to divide the rope in half, and to tie the two parts thereof together again. It was then full long, and did reach the ground, and I went down in safety. How could this have been? End of The Strange Escape of the King's Jester. The Solution to the Strange Escape of the King's Jester, The Mysterious Rope, by Henry Ernest Dedany. Coffee Break Collection 23. Mysteries, Riddles, and Conundrums. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Solution to the Strange Escape of the King's Jester, The Mysterious Rope. Although the king's jester promised that he would thereafter make the manner thereof plain to all, there is no record of his having ever done so. I will therefore submit to the reader my own views as to the probable solutions to the mysteries involved. When the jester divided his rope in half, it does not follow that he cut it into two parts, each half the original length of the rope. No doubt he simply untwisted the strands, and so divided it into two ropes, each of the original length, but one half the thickness. He would thus be able to tie the two together and make a rope nearly twice the original length, with which it is quite conceivable that he made good his escape from the dungeon. End of The Solution to the Strange Escape of the King's Jester, The Mysterious Rope. The Squire's Christmas Puzzle Party, from the Canterbury Puzzles and Other Curious Problems, by Henry Ernest Dedany. Coffee Break Collection 23. Mysteries, Riddles, and Conundrums. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Squire's Christmas Puzzle Party. This is the puzzle of the 3 teacups. A fine specimen of the old English country gentleman was Squire Davidge of Stoke Corsey Hall in Somerset. When the last century was yet in its youth, there were few men in the West Country more widely known and more generally respected and beloved than he. A born sportsman, his fame extended to Exmoor itself, where his daring and splendid riding in pursuit of the red deer had excited the admiration and envy of innumerable younger huntsmen. But it was in his own parish, and particularly in his own home, that his genial hospitality, generosity, and rare jovial humor made him the idol of his friends, and even of his relations, which sometimes means a good deal. At Christmas it was always an open house at Stoke Corsey Hall, for if there was one thing more than another upon which Squire Davidge had very pronounced views, it was on the question of keeping up in a royal fashion the great festival of Yuletide. "Hark ye, my lads," he would say to his sons, "our country will begin to fall on evil days if ever we grow indifferent to the claims of those Christmas festivities that have helped win us the proud name of Merry England." Therefore, when I say that Christmas at Stoke Corsey was kept up in the good old happy, rollicking, festive style that our grandfathers and great-grandfathers so dearly loved, it will be unnecessary for me to attempt a description. We have a faithful picture of these merry scenes in the Bracebridge Hall of Washington Irving. I must confine myself in this sketch to one special feature in the squire's round of jollification during the season of peace and goodwill. He took a curious and intelligent interest in puzzles of every kind, and there was always one night devoted to what was known as Squire Davidge's puzzle party. Every guest was expected to come armed with some riddle or puzzle for the bewilderment and possible delectation of the company. The old gentleman always presented a new watch to the guest who was most successful in his answers. It is a pity that all the puzzles were not preserved, but I propose to present to my readers a few selected from a number that have passed down to a surviving member of the family, who has kindly allowed me to use them on this occasion. There are some very easy ones, a few that are moderately difficult, and one hard brain-racker, so all should be able to find something to their taste. The little record is written in the neat angular hand of a young lady of that day, and the puzzles, the conditions of which I think best to give mainly in my own words, for the sake of clearness, appear to have been all propounded on one occasion. This recording includes one of the puzzles, entitled The 3 Teacups. One lady, of whom our fair historian records with delightful inconsequence, this Miss Charity Lockyer has since been married to a curate from Taunton Vale, placed 3 empty teacups on a table, and challenged anybody to put 10 lumps of sugar in them, so that there would be an odd number of lumps in every cup. One young man who has been to Oxford University and is studying the law declared with some heat that beyond a doubt there was no possible way of doing it, and he offered to give proof of the fact to the company. It must have been interesting to see his face when he was shown Miss Charity's correct answer. End of an excerpt from the Squire's Christmas Puzzle Party. The Squire's Christmas Puzzle Party by Henry Ernest Dedany. From the Canterbury Puzzles and Other Curious Problems. This is the solution for his puzzle entitled The 3 Teacups. Coffee Break Collection 23, Mysteries, Riddles, and Conundrums. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Squire's Christmas Puzzle Party. How the various tricks were done. The record of one of Squire Davidge's annual puzzle parties made by the old gentleman's young lady relative, who had often spent a Merry Christmas at Stoke Corsey Hall, does not contain the solutions of the mysteries, so I'll give my own answers to the puzzles and try to make them as clear as possible to those who may be more or less novices in such matters. This is the solution for the 3 teacups. Miss Charity Lockyer clearly must have had a trick up her sleeve, and I think it highly probable that it was conceived on the following lines. She proposed that 10 lumps of sugar should be placed in 3 teacups, so that there should be an odd number of lumps in every cup. The illustration here perhaps shows Miss Charity's answer, and the figures on the cups indicate the number of lumps that have been separately placed in them. By placing the cup that holds 1 lump inside the one that holds 2 lumps, it can be correctly stated that every cup contains an odd number of lumps. One cup holds 7 lumps, another holds 1 lump, while the third cup holds 3 lumps. It is evident that if a cup contains another cup, it also contains the content of that second cup. There are in all 15 different solutions to the puzzle. Here they are: 109, 145, 901, 307, 703, 721, 127, 523, 541, 505, 343, 361, 325, 163, 181. The first numbers in a triplet represent respectively the number of lumps to be placed in the inner and outer of the 2 cups that are placed one inside the other. It will be noted that the outer cup of the pair may itself be empty. End of the solution for the Squire's Christmas Puzzle Party.